1380. No soft underwear. The constant itch of linen and hemp rags during the English Middle Ages. Say those words again. Let them land. Because before the first light of a medieval English morning had even broken over the frost-covered hills of Somerset, before the church bell had rung its first call to prayer, before a single fire had been coaxed back to life in the cold hearths of Ashwick village, a young woman named Marjorie was already awake, already pulling a rough linen shift over her head, already wincing as the coarse fabric dragged across the back of her neck, across her shoulders, down along her arms, already beginning another day inside the one thing she could never escape, the cloth against her skin, the itch that never stopped. England in 1380 was a country still bleeding from the wounds of the Black Death, still struggling under the weight of heavy taxes, still raw from decades of war with France. The peasant revolt was only a year away, though no one in Ashwick knew that yet. What they knew was simpler and harder than politics. They knew hunger and cold. They knew the sound of the landlord's horse coming down the lane. They knew what it meant to work from before sunrise to after sunset and still not have enough. And they knew, every single day of their lives, the relentless, grinding, inescapable discomfort of the fabric they wore against their bodies. There was no soft underwear in medieval England. Not for ordinary people. Not for the farmers and the millers and the shepherds and the laundresses and the smiths and the brewers and the hundreds of thousands of invisible hands that kept the country moving. Soft fabric existed. Fine linen existed. Silk existed, brought at enormous expense from Italy and the East, worn by the nobility and the high clergy and the wealthy merchants of London. But those things might as well have existed on another planet for all the difference they made to Marjorie and her mother Agnes, living in their one-room stone cottage at the edge of Ashwick, with a leaking roof, a temperamental pig, and a small plot of land that gave just enough to keep them alive if the weather was merciful and the steward was not too greedy. Marjorie was 17. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw and hands that were already rougher than they should have been at her age. Her father, Edmund, had died 3 winters back from a fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. Since then, it had been the two of them, Marjorie and Agnes, managing the land alone, which meant managing everything alone. The planting, the harvesting, the animal care, the cooking, the mending, the endless negotiations with neighbors and traders, and the Lord Steward who came twice a year to take what was owed, and sometimes a little more besides. The cottage itself was not large. One room served as kitchen, bedroom, storage, and workshop all at once. The floor was packed earth covered in rushes that were changed every few weeks, or whenever Agnes decided the smell had become truly unacceptable. The walls were stone, which kept out the wind but absorbed the cold and held it like a grudge. A single window, covered in oiled cloth rather than glass because glass was for churches and manor houses, let in a gray, filtered light during the day. At night, they relied on the fire and a single tallow candle that Agnes used sparingly. Against one wall hung their clothing. 2 kirtles each, the long woolen overdresses that were the standard garment of working women in medieval England. Marjorie's were a dull, brownish red, dyed with madder root years ago, and faded now to something closer to rust. Agnes's were a darker brown, almost the color of the earth outside their door. And beneath the kirtles, hung on separate pegs, were their shifts, the undergarments, the layer closest to the skin that stayed there from morning to night, day after day, week after week. The shifts were linen, mostly linen. The original fabric had been plain woven flax, grown locally and processed by hand in a long series of steps that included retting, which meant soaking the stalks in water for weeks to loosen the fibers, then drying, then breaking, then scutching, then hackling, then spinning, then weaving. It was an enormous amount of labor for a fabric that was still, at the end of all of it, quite coarse. The threads were uneven. The weave was loose in some places and tight in others. The edges were finished with a folded hem that created a ridge of double-thick fabric that could rub a raw line into the skin at the wrist or the ankle if you were not careful about how you moved. And then there were the patches. Because shifts were worn until they fell apart, and when pieces fell apart they were replaced with whatever was available. Hemp, most often. Hemp rags that came from worn-out rope or sacking or the scraps left over after heavier cloth had been cut for some other purpose. Hemp was rougher than linen. Where linen merely scratched, hemp had the quality of very fine sandpaper, a persistent, insistent abrasion that did not let you forget it was there. Marjorie had a hemp patch on her left side near the hip, where the original linen had simply disintegrated one washing day, and Agnes had sewn in a piece of hemp sacking because there was nothing else available. Every morning when Marjorie dressed, she was aware of that patch. Every evening when she undressed, there was a faint red mark on her skin where it had been. She had never known anything different. Neither had her mother or her grandmother before her, or anyone she had ever met in Ashwick. This was simply what cloth felt like. This was simply what skin felt like by the end of the day. You endured it. You endured it the way you endured the cold and the mud and the backache and the hunger and the thin weeks before the spring harvest. You endured it because there was no alternative, and because alternatives were not something ordinary people in 1380 spent much time imagining. Imagination of that kind was a luxury, like soft fabric itself. The morning Marjorie went to the weaver's workshop began like every other morning. She rose in the dark, pulling the shift over her head and feeling the familiar scratch of the collar against her neck. She dressed quietly so as not to wake her mother, who had been coughing since the first frost and needed the extra rest. She stirred the fire back to life with a stick, added a small piece of wood, and hung the pot over it to heat water for the morning porridge. She fed the chickens, checked the pig, walked to the well at the center of the village and back, carrying the heavy wooden bucket with the automatic competence of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 times. Ashwick was beginning to wake around her. She could see smoke rising from the other cottages, hear the sound of the miller's wheel beginning to turn in the distance, catch the smell of bread baking in the communal oven near the church. Thomas the tanner was already at work, which Marjorie always knew before she saw him because of the smell that preceded him everywhere he went. The blacksmith's apprentice was carrying charcoal across the yard. 2 older women were walking together toward the well, talking in low voices that stopped when Marjorie passed and resumed when she was far enough away not to hear. She was used to that. After her father died, there had been a period of particular vulnerability for her and Agnes. A period when certain men in the village had looked at them in a way that made Marjorie's skin prickle with something colder than the shift against her neck. But Agnes had handled it with a combination of fierce practicality and strategic alliances, forming close ties with Joan the weaver's wife and with the widow of the former miller, women who had enough standing in the village to discourage the most brazen behaviors. It had worked, mostly. There were still the low voices that stopped when she passed, but there was no longer anything more dangerous than that, and Marjorie had learned to count that as a victory. She passed the weaver's workshop on her way back from the well and stopped. She had been planning to stop. She needed fabric scraps, and Edmund the weaver was the most likely source. She stood in the open doorway and looked in at the man working his loom in the gray morning light, his movements the slow, precise rhythm of long expertise. On the workbench beside him was a bolt of cloth she had never seen before. Even in the dim light, from 6 feet away, she could see that it was different from what she was used to. It had a smoothness, a consistency of weave that the rough linen of her shift entirely lacked. It caught the light differently. Edmund noticed her in the doorway and stopped his work. He had the sharp, calculating eyes of a man who had spent decades negotiating prices and knew the value of everything down to the last inch of thread. "Marjorie," he said. It was not a greeting exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement of her existence, which from Edmund was about as warm as it got. "I need scraps," she said. "Mother sent me. We need to reline the shift before the hard cold comes." Edmund looked at her steadily. "What are you offering?" She had prepared for this. She had 6 eggs from their chickens, which were laying reasonably well for the time of year. She had some dried thyme from her mother's garden. She had half an afternoon of labor, which she could offer in the form of help with the sorting and bundling of finished cloth that Edmund's wife, Joan, usually did alone. She began to lay out these options in the careful, measured way Agnes had taught her, presenting them not as a plea but as a transaction. Fair value for fair value. She was midway through her offer when Joan appeared from the back room. Joan was a large, comfortable woman whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere of any room she entered, not through noise or drama, but through a quality of settled certainty. as if wherever Joan stood was automatically the correct place to stand. She took in the situation in a single look and made her decision before Marjorie had finished speaking. "Edmund," Joan said, in the tone of a woman who had been making final decisions for 30 years, "give her the leftover ends from the Bolton order. They're too short for anything useful." Edmund's face went through its familiar sequence of expressions: objection, calculation, resignation. He went to the large chest in the corner and produced a bundle of fabric scraps. Linen, decently woven, with a consistency of thread and a smoothness of weave that was noticeably superior to what Marjorie was used to. Not the finest linen she had ever seen, but fine enough to be remarkable by her standards. She took the bundle and held it, and for a moment she just felt it. The way the fabric moved in her hands differently from what she owned. The way the weave was even and the surface was smoother against her palm. It was not soft, not by any comparison she would have made years later in a different century, but relative to the coarse, patched, hemp-supplemented linen of her own shift, it was noticeably, measurably different. It was better. It was simply, clearly, objectively better. Joan watched her face. "Come sit for a moment," she said. "Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because we tell stories here that no history book will ever show you, the real lives of real people from forgotten centuries, and if you miss a single video, you miss something that matters." Joan poured 2 cups of a thin ale that was the standard morning drink of medieval England, safer than the water which was not always reliable, and set one in front of Marjorie. She settled herself on her bench with the easy authority of a woman in her own domain. Edmund had returned to his loom, which both of them understood meant that he was listening, but preferred the fiction of not listening. "My mother always said," Joan began, and she said it in the way that older women in Ashwick always began important things, with a reference to a mother or grandmother or aunt, as if wisdom only became wisdom when it had been handed down. "That the cloth against your skin tells you who you are in this world, not who you should be. Who you are." Marjorie wrapped her hands around the ale cup. "My mother says the same kind of thing." "Most mothers do," Joan agreed. "Because it's true. Look at me and Edmund. We do well. We eat meat twice a week. I have a wool blanket that I did not have to make myself. Edmund has leather shoes without holes in them. And my shift," she smoothed her hand across the front of her kirtle, "is decent linen. Not fine, not like what the lady of the manor wears, but decent. Even weave. No hemp rags." She looked at Marjorie steadily. "Do I deserve that more than you do?" Marjorie said nothing, which was the honest answer. "I don't," Joan said simply. "I was born to a weaver's family. I married a weaver. I have spent my life surrounded by cloth. It's nothing I earned through being better than you or your mother. It's luck of birth and circumstance. Same as the difference between us and the Lord's household." She picked up her own cup. "They have silk against their skin. Silk. Do they deserve that more than I deserve decent linen? More than you deserve linen that doesn't leave marks on your skin by evening?" From the loom, without turning around, Edmund said quietly, "The world is not arranged according to what people deserve." "No," Joan agreed. "It is arranged according to who has the coin to pay for what they want. And coin is not a measure of worth. It is a measure of what family you were born into and how the seasons treated your harvest." Marjorie turned the fabric scraps over in her hands. She thought about her grandmother, who had died before Marjorie was old enough to remember her clearly, but whose presence lived in the stories Agnes told. A woman who had worked every day of her life and worn hemp rags and rough linen and never, not once in her life, worn anything against her skin that did not scratch. A woman who had been, by every account Agnes gave, decent and hard-working and honest and kind. Who had deserved better, if deserving had anything to do with anything. Who had not gotten it. She thought about the steward who would come in 3 weeks for the Michaelmas payment. She thought about the silk lining she had once glimpsed inside his cloak when the wind caught it, that brief flash of something smooth and luminous that had nothing to do with mud or scratching, or the smell of livestock, or the particular tiredness that lived permanently in her shoulders. She thought about the distance between that silk lining and the hemp patch on her left hip. She thanked Joan and Edmund, and carried the fabric scraps home through the cool autumn morning. Agnes was awake when she returned, sitting by the fire with her drop spindle, her fingers moving in their automatic rhythm. She looked at the fabric Marjorie set on the table and reached out to touch it without speaking. She ran her thumb across the weave, feeling its evenness. Her face was very still. "Joan gave it to you," Agnes said. It was not a question. "She said it was left over from an order, too short for anything useful." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That woman has a generous spirit dressed in practical clothing." She picked up the scraps and began to assess them for how they could best be used. "We'll use the largest piece for the inner collar on your shift. That's where the chafing is worst. The smaller pieces can go at the wrist seams." They worked that evening, the two of them, by the light of the fire and the single tallow candle. Agnes's fingers, despite the thickening of the joints that came from years of work in cold and damp, were still precise and sure with a needle. She cut and fitted and stitched with the economical movements of someone for whom fabric was never wasted. Every scrap assessed for its maximum usefulness before anything was trimmed away. Marjorie watched her mother work and felt the particular combination of love and grief and respect that came from watching someone be excellent at something hard that they had never chosen and could not escape. Agnes had not chosen to spend her life mending coarse cloth and managing an inadequate plot of land alone. She had chosen to love Marjorie's father, which had led to all the rest of it, and she had accepted what life had arranged around that choice with a kind of fierce, silent competence that Marjorie had grown up mistaking for contentment. Only in recent years had she begun to understand that it was something different, not contentment. Endurance shaped into something that looked like strength because there was no one around to see when it was actually just endurance. The shift, when they had finished mending it, was still rough. Still the same basic garment it had always been, with its hemp patches and its uneven linen and its thick hemmed seams. But at the collar, where Marjorie had chafed worst for years, there was now a band of the better linen Joan had given them. And at the wrists, where the old fabric had been wearing thin, there were new seams of the same, smoother and more evenly woven than anything around them. It would not transform her life. It would not change what the steward took at Michaelmas, or what the winter would demand of them, or what her skin would look like by February after months of rough cloth and cold water and work that never stopped. But in the morning, when she pulled the shift over her head and settled it against her body, the collar would be different. The wrists would be different. There would be places where the scratch was less. And that was something. In 1380, in Ashwick, in a one-room stone cottage with a leaking roof and a temperamental pig and a small plot of land that gave just enough, that was something real. If you have ever endured something in silence, something small and constant and impossible to explain to anyone who has not felt it themselves, leave a comment right now and write, "I felt this." Because you are not watching this alone, and the person sitting next to you in this moment, even if they are 1,000 miles away, knows exactly what you mean. The weeks between that morning and the steward's arrival passed in the way that autumn weeks passed in medieval England, in a long, continuous blur of work and weather, and the gradual shortening of days that made everything feel more urgent and more tired at once. The harvest had been reasonable, not excellent, but reasonable. The pig had been healthy. The chickens were laying. Agnes's cough had not worsened, which was the most important thing, because a cough that worsened in autumn often became something far more serious by January, something that Agnes had watched happen to too many people she knew. Marjorie found herself thinking often about the conversation with Joan, about the silk lining on the steward's cloak, about the distance between what people wore against their skin and what they deserved to wear against their skin, and the complete disconnection between those two things. It was not a new thought. She had felt the unfairness of it before, in the way that everyone who worked with their hands and wore rough cloth and ate porridge on most mornings felt the unfairness of the world's arrangements without quite having words for it. But Joan had given her words for it, or something close to words, and that made it both easier and harder to carry. The steward arrived on a Tuesday, which was market day in the nearest town, and therefore one of the days when the village was quietest, most of the men having gone to sell or trade. This was not accidental. The steward had been doing this for long enough to understand that collecting payment from a village full of tired, cold, anxious people was easier when the people most likely to object were elsewhere. He arrived with his scribe and 2 men who rode behind him without speaking, whose presence was not needed for any clerical purpose, but whose size and silence served a function that everyone understood. Marjorie was at the cottage when he came. Agnes was inside, sitting by the fire, too tired that day for anything strenuous. The steward's name was Richard Welby, and he was a man in his early 50s who had spent his career in service to the lord of the manor and had grown into the role so completely that it was impossible to imagine him as anything else. He wore good wool, well dyed, without visible mending. His cloak was the one with the silk lining. His hands, when he dismounted and handed his reins to the scribe, were uncalloused. He came to their door and Marjorie met him there, because Agnes had said it was better for Marjorie to do the talking when the amount owed was close to the amount they had, which it was this season. Agnes said that older women reminded Welby of obligations and younger women reminded him that there were other things in the world besides rent, and that this was a useful difference if handled carefully. The conversation was short and conducted entirely on the surface of things. Welby stated the amount owed. Marjorie produced it, in coin and in kind, the exact amount and nothing more. Welby's scribe noted it down. Welby looked at the cottage and the small yard and the pig and the garden with the assessing eye of a man calculating whether there was more to be had and decided there was not, or not enough to be worth the trouble of argument. He nodded. He left. Marjorie stood in the doorway and watched him ride away down the lane, his cloak moving in the wind, that brief glimpse of silk lining catching the afternoon light. She stood there for a long time after he had disappeared around the bend. Agnes's voice came from inside. "Did he take it all?" "Yes," Marjorie said. "Exactly what was owed." "Good," Agnes said. "Come in, it's cold." She went in. She sat by the fire beside her mother. The tallow candle was not lit because it was still light enough to manage without it. The fire gave its small, smoky warmth. The smell of the rushes on the floor, dry now and beginning to need changing, mixed with the smell of wood smoke and the faint animal smell from the pig in its enclosure outside. Marjorie pulled at the collar of her shift absently, feeling the band of better linen Joan had given them. It was still there. Still different. Still, in its small way, easier than what had been there before. She did not speak, and Agnes did not press her, and they sat together in the way that people who have lived through hard things together can sit, in a silence that is not empty but full of everything that does not need to be said because it is already understood. The winter that year came hard and fast, the way the worst winters always came, not gradually and with warning but suddenly, overnight, a cold that descended before anyone was fully ready for it. The first real freeze came in late November, earlier than most years, and by December the ground was iron hard and the well in the village center had a skim of ice each morning that needed breaking before water could be drawn. Inside the cottage, Marjorie and Agnes managed. They had enough wood, carefully accumulated through the autumn. They had enough food, enough preserved vegetables, enough dried beans and salted pork from the pig they had kept healthy through the year. They slept with their cloaks over their shifts, close to the fire, and when the fire burned low in the deepest part of the night, they lay very still and breathed slow and waited for morning. The shift against Marjorie's skin in those winter nights was an intimate thing, in the way that all discomfort becomes intimate when it is constant. The scratch of the collar at her neck, the familiar roughness of the linen along her sides, the hemp patch at her hip, which in the cold seemed to stiffen slightly, becoming even less yielding, and at the collar, the softer band. At her wrists, the better seams, small islands of relative ease in the surrounding scratch. She thought on those long winter nights about all the women who had lain in this same cottage or one like it, in the cold dark, wearing roughly the same garment against their skin, feeling roughly the same things. Her mother, her grandmother's mother before that, stretching back through generations of women she would never know, who had worn hemp rags and coarse linen and endured the constant itch that never stopped. Women who had been, most of them, decent and hard-working and kind, who had loved people and been loved, who had built things and kept things alive and passed things forward, who had never, not once in their lives, felt silk or fine cotton or any of the things that existed in the world but not for them. And she thought that Joan was right, that endurance was its own kind of worth. Not because suffering was noble, because it was not. There was nothing noble about a hemp patch rubbing a red mark into your skin every single day of your life simply because you could not afford better. But because the women who had endured it and still been decent and still been loving and still passed something worth having forward to the next generation had done something real, had been something real, had mattered in ways that the silk lining of a steward's cloak could never make someone matter. She pulled her cloak tighter and listened to her mother's breathing even out into sleep. Outside, the wind moved through Ashwick with the particular sound of winter wind through a village of thatched rooftops, a high, searching sound that found every gap and tested every corner. The fire settled. The darkness pressed against the oiled cloth over the window. Marjorie closed her eyes. The collar of her shift touched her neck. The better linen Joan had given them was there against her collar, against her wrists where the mending had placed it. Small, quiet islands. Not soft, not truly, but softer. Enough to notice. Enough to be grateful for, in the precise, clear-eyed way that people who have very little learn to be grateful for small things without confusing small things for enough. Because they were not enough, and everyone knew they were not enough. And knowing that clearly, without bitterness and without resignation, knowing it as a fact about the world that was worth understanding and worth passing forward, was perhaps the most important kind of knowledge you could carry through a medieval English winter in a rough linen shift that scratched you every day of your life. Spring came as it always did, not as a single day, but as a slow accumulation of signs. The ice at the well gone in the mornings, the ground softening, the first pale green along the hedgerows that Agnes could identify by name, and Marjorie had learned to read as language, the language of a coming season, of work that was about to change from the long, static endurance of winter into the urgent, physical, perpetually behind-schedule labor of planting and growing and preparing. The morning the first real warmth came, Marjorie stood in the doorway of the cottage in her shift and her kirtle, before the day's work had properly begun, and felt the sun on her face for the first time in months. It was gentle and thin, the early spring sun, not the full weight of summer, but something tentative and promising. A beginning. She was still wearing the same shift. It had been washed 3 times through the winter, each time in cold water because hot water required wood, and wood was rationed. The hemp patch at her hip was wearing further, beginning to fray at one edge in a way that would need attention before summer. The collar still scratched. The wrists were better still, where Agnes's mending had placed the better linen. Still those small islands. Behind her, Agnes was moving around the cottage, beginning the morning with the same movements she made every morning, fire, pot, spindle, the rhythms of a life lived very close to its own requirements. She was coughing less now that the worst cold had passed, and the quality of her movement had changed. A little more ease in it. A little less of the careful conservation that deep winter imposed. Marjorie thought about Joan's words again, standing in the doorway with the thin spring sun on her face and the scratch of her shift at her neck. About the cloth against your skin, and what it told you about who you were in the world, about the difference between who you were and who you deserved to be. She thought that she was more than her shift, more than the hemp patch and the coarse linen and the constant itch and the steward's silk-lined cloak and the distance between those two things. She was the sum of everything Agnes had taught her, and everything her grandmother had endured, and everything she herself had figured out in the cold, dark nights of a hard English winter. She was the careful economy of the mending, and the quiet generosity of Joan, and the flat, honest wisdom of Edmund at his loom. She was every morning she had risen before the sun, and every evening she had fallen asleep, still itching, and every day in between that she had done what needed doing with the materials available to her. That was not nothing. In 1380, in Ashwick, in a one-room stone cottage at the edge of a muddy hillside in Somerset, with a rough linen shift against her skin and a spring morning beginning around her, that was not nothing at all. It was a life, real and itching and imperfect and hers. And she carried it forward, the way her grandmother had, the way her mother did, the way every woman in the long chain behind her had carried it forward, one scratchy morning at a time, into whatever came next. No soft underwear. The constant itch of linen and hemp rags during the English Middle Ages. And in the middle of all of it, in the middle of the discomfort and the poverty and the vast unfairness of a world arranged by coin rather than worth, something that endured. Something that persisted. Something that, for lack of a better word, and in the most ordinary and unromantic and real way possible, could be called the human spirit. Not because it rose above its circumstances, but because it kept going inside them. Day after day, morning after morning, shift after shift. That is the story of Marjorie, and of Agnes, and of every woman in Ashwick who scratched herself to sleep and rose the next morning and did it all again.